Hello, I'm Brian Larkin, coordinator of Edinburgh Peace and Justice Centre. Welcome to our Conscientious Objectors Day Scotland virtual vigil, our first online gathering of this kind. We'll have contributions today from a number of participants who are with us from home. Conscientious objection is an issue about which I'm passionate. Growing up in the 1960s in the US, the Vietnam War came home to us nightly on the TV news. Later, while working in a shelter for the homeless, I saw the damage that war can do to those who fight, men destroyed by PTSD. Wars destroy the lives of millions of people, mostly civilians. No one should be forced to take part in that. A few years after the end of the Vietnam War, at the height of the Cold War, when I was 20, the US reinstituted a legal requirement for all young men ages 18 to 35 to register with the Selective Service, a preliminary step to possible conscription. Seeing this as state preparation that I feared could lead to a war that would actually end not only war, but life on this planet, I risked imprisonment and refused to cooperate. Now the US is again contemplating requiring registration, and this time to include women. And it's not the only country. This is our 6th annual Scotland CO Day Vigil. The first was in 2014, marking the centenary of the First World War. Previous vigils have featured descendants of World War I conscientious objectors. COs continued to be imprisoned up until April of 1920. With this vigil, we mark that centenary with descendants of First World War conscientious objectors remembering them. We'll also remember conscientious objectors from the Second World War, hear about work being done to ensure recognition of conscientious objection as a right, and about some contemporary conscientious objectors, because many people continue to be imprisoned today for refusing to take part in wars around the world. Hundreds of thousands of refugees flee from wars in places like Syria and Afghanistan. Among them, many young men and women who refuse to take part in those wars. They should be granted asylum based on the human right to refuse conscription. Today's vigil is in solidarity with them. We also have with us Protest in Harmony, with a song inspired by women's resistance to First World War conscription, and artist Kate I, who will tell about her inspiring design for the opposing war memorial. Singer-songwriter Penny Stone will be with us in person later. And now, to get us started, here's a little video Penny has created especially for this occasion.
Lay down your sword and shield, lay your weapons down, lay down your guns by the riverside. Lay down your sword and shield, lay your weapons down, lay down your guns by the riverside. Lay down your sword and shield, lay your weapons down, lay down your guns by the riverside. Ain't gonna study war. Lay down your sword and shield. Ain't gonna study war. Lay your weapons down, lay down your guns, lay down your guns by the riverside. Ain't gonna study war. Lay down your sword and shield. Ain't gonna study war. Lay your weapons down, lay down your guns, lay down your guns by the riverside. Ain't gonna study war. Lay down your sword and shield. Ain't gonna study war. Lay your weapons down, lay down your guns, lay down your guns by the riverside. Ain't gonna study war. Lay study war. Lay your weapons down, lay down your guns, lay down your guns by the riverside. Ain't gonna study war. Lay down your sword and shield. Ain't gonna study war. Lay your weapons down, lay down your guns, lay down your guns by the riverside. Study war, lay your weapons down, lay down your guns, lay down your guns by the riverside. Lay down your sword and shield, lay your weapons down, lay down your guns by the riverside.
Thank you so much, Penny. That was so beautiful. Next, we're going to hear from Eileen Holtom, who's going to tell us about her father, Victor Holtom, who was a conscientious objector during the Second World War.
So I'm Eileen, and I'm going to speak first about my father, Victor Holtom. I'm not sure if anyone, Andrew might have known him. So my father was, he grew up as a Baptist. He was born in London. But as a young man, he turned to the Quakers, and he was active in the Wood Green meeting to 1947, then in the Glasgow meeting from 1947 to 1980, and then in the Edinburgh meeting from 1980 to 1989. I have, of course, he was of an age to be called up during the Second World War. And I'm going to read some of his statement of faith that he had to present to the tribunal to be accepted as a conscientious objector. And he said, "As a Christian, I base my objection to any form of military service on my conviction that all war is opposed to the spirit and teaching of Jesus Christ. I regard men of all nations as children of one Father, and feel that war, which involves not only the bodily but also the spiritual hurt of my fellows, is an offence against God in which I can have no part. Though I am fully aware of the nature of the forces this country is fighting, I have no faith in this or any war as a means of preserving Christian values and civilized ideals. I believe this method promotes the destruction of the thing it seeks to defend. I believe it is wrong for a nation to seek security in military strength, and I maintain that a nation acting on the conviction that all war is wrong would receive the strength and wisdom to face the consequences without fear. And my conviction is deeper than words." I first began thinking on these lines before I left school, and shortly after, when I began attending meetings of the Society of Friends. Then my pacifist faith was deepened, and I later became a member of the Society. Though I cherish the ideals for which most of my fellow countrymen feel impelled to fight, and accept my own share in the responsibility for the disaster which has overtaken the world, I believe it is my highest duty to be loyal to my faith. I am eager as any to be of service, but will only accept service as an alternative to military service, which I definitely feel clear to undertake. On this subject, I cannot say more at present, as all will depend on how I am guided at the time. And he says, I consciously object to A, being registered in the military service register, to B, to performing military services, and C, to performing combatant duties. And I apply to the local tribunal to be registered accordingly. And of course, my father, because he was already a Quaker, they readily registered him as a conscientious objector, and he served through the war with, as an air raid precautions, person, he was patrolling the streets of London after dark, making sure that the blackouts were properly done. And so he continued in his Quaker faith until he died. Now, the second person I'm going to speak about is my father's older cousin. He was called Eric Holtom, and I think that he had quite an influence on my father. And Eric Holtom was born of Quaker parents in Linton, and from the village school he went to the French school, Saffron Walden, and then to a Quaker school called Bootham in York. And in 1914 he was just starting out at Cambridge University. And of course, the First World War started. Now, he was already a Quaker, and he did a very brave thing. He enlisted in the Friends Ambulance Unit, and he served with that ambulance unit in France under fire for 2.5 years. And for that, he was awarded the Croix de Guerre by the French government, a very big honor for a civilian to receive that award. So then he went back to Cambridge and he graduated with honors in botany. And his main life's work was to be in Singapore. He went out there in 1922. And by 1925, he was director of the Botanical Garden in Singapore. And he was doing that. And he devoted his life to the study of living tropical plants, ferns, gingers, bamboos, and orchids. And there's some, I can hear some back noise. Anyway, so he was director to 1942, and the Japanese marched in to Singapore. And initially, he would have gone with the other British residents. But Emperor Hirohito was a very keen botanist, and he wanted all the botanical gardens in any place the Japanese had conquered. He wanted those gardens to be properly run. So he sent for the Emperor Hirohito sent out to Singapore a Japanese professor of botany. Now, it so happened that Eric Holtom and the Japanese professor had met at botanical conferences. And the professor requested the Japanese emperor that he would allow Eric Holtom to stay and continue his botanical work in the Singapore Botanical Garden. Now, this is not necessarily what Eric Holtom wanted. And later he actually put in a formal request to go with the other British because he knew how much they were suffering during the occupation, but he was not allowed to go. So he had 3 years of uninterrupted research because he was relieved of his administrative duties, but he kept on with his research. And at the end of the war, he continued for another 4 years as director before he came back to Britain. And his work was of great value to Singapore because it was the basis for a commercial business in orchids, which they developed after he was gone. So I'm partly taking this from an obituary because some of it I didn't know. His outstanding achievements brought him worldwide recognition. He had honorary degrees from several universities, and he won gold medals. He won the gold medal of the American Orchid Society, gold medal of the Malayan Orchid Society, and he won the Royal Horticultural Society medal in 1972. Now, the last paragraph is very nice. It says, he, however, was a very modest, unassuming man, greatly liked for his wide views, helpfulness, kindness, and geniality among botanists, horticulturalists, and members of the Society of Friends. His testimony at Quaker meetings for worship arose out of his deep spiritual insight, which he also revealed in his contributions to Friends Quarterly on scientific and religious truth, on metaphysics and mysticism, and on a personal Christian view. Now, both of those men died in 1970, and I think I'm very, very lucky because I remember them both very vividly, and they were both a wonderful example of a Christian pacifist man. So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
So next we want to hear from Ken Duffy. Ken's going to be remembering Arthur Woodburn, who was, I think, the longest serving conscientious objector of the First World War, and had quite an illustrious career later on that Ken will, I'm sure, tell us about.
Hello, everyone. Can everyone hear me? Yeah, good. I'm very pleased to be with you all today at this vigil to remember Arthur Woodburn, who rose from being a despised conscientious objector to become both an MP and Secretary of State for Scotland. Arthur was born in 1890, the youngest of 7 surviving children. There were a lot more, but they didn't survive, unfortunately. He was my mother's uncle. Her father, George Woodburn, was Arthur's elder brother. As Brian has said, Arthur Woodburn was the longest serving CO prisoner in Scotland. He received 5 sentences and was imprisoned for almost 2.5 years from October 1916 until his release from Colton in March 1919 following a short hunger strike. When Colton Jail was being demolished in 1931, here we see it now on the screen, to make way for the building of the Scottish Office and St Andrew's House, Arthur famously bought paving stones from his old prison to lay a garden path at his home in Orchard Road. One of my colleagues, Louise Yeoman, pointed out that this was a reminder that his path to power was not old labour or new labour, but hard labour. Arthur swapped his cell for an Art Deco walnut panelled office when he returned to the site as the Secretary of State for Scotland from 1947 to 1950 in Attlee's post-war Labour government. How did all this begin? Well, he started work at the age of 16 at Miller's London Road Foundry, where he found employment as a clerk for 25 years. He, after leaving school at 14, he studied extensively evening classes and developed an early interest in moral economics. Later on, he studied Norman Angel's The Great Illusion and Brailsford's The War of Steel and Gold. This informed his more recent political thinking that opened up new vistas for him politically. When war broke out, Millers were involved. You know, they were a small part in this, but they were an important part. He saw at firsthand how the big armaments firms could control smaller firms like Miller's to maintain monopoly and their profits. Woodburn was in many ways a political evangelist. You know, he was appalled that the government allowed profiteers to make easy money from the war while young men were losing their lives at the front. He joined the ILP in 1915, and like many ethical socialists, he developed a very critical pacifist stand to the war. His clear objective was to do all he could as an individual to stop the war. He also joined the Anti-Conscription League, which I believe is a more muscular version of the No Conscription Fellowship. He joined this when conscription was introduced in January 1916. Arthur first met his future wife, Barbara Holliday, at a rehearsal for one of the many ILP socials they attended. She was a pianist and a contralto. He was a powerful baritone. He also became close friends with her father and her brothers, Francis and Tom, who both became COs. The Hallidays were all Labour activists in touch with a network of pacifists and war resistors throughout Scotland. This included Jimmy Maxton, who became very well known and associated with the ILP. Arthur became engaged to Barbara in the guardroom at Glencorse Barracks before one of his 5 court-martials. She purchased and brought the ring. He was able to devise some way of using his cell window to signal to Barbara when she was standing on the Calton Hill that he was okay. They married after his release in 1919. Although he was what was called a badged man in a reserved occupation exempt from service, Arthur stuck his head in the noose by writing to the authorities declaring his resistance and opposition to conscription and to the war. This made him feel free to advocate his opposition to the war in the press and at public meetings with a clearer conscience. His first public speech at the Mount appealed for an immediate end to the war. Woodburn was now a marked man. His exemption at Millers was removed, and he was now seen as the leader of war resistance in the Edinburgh area. Arthur was 25 when he applied for absolute exemption from service at a local tribunal in February 1916 on the grounds of his conscientious objection, stating, "I do not believe in war. I believe it is absolutely wrong to take human life. I believe that man's conscience is the only power to which a man can give absolute obedience and cannot therefore consent by silence to any other being assuming that power." Following following refusal, his first appeal on 20 March was dismissed. He then concluded his final appeal by stating again, "I cannot accept the decision because I earnestly believe that my attitude towards the war and my endeavours to have an immediate peace declared is the best service I can render humanity, and therefore must make all sacrifices and give all my strength to that end." You know, his political objection wasn't really intended by the authorities to be a valid objection. So any slim chance of his final appeal succeeding evaporated when a Zeppelin bombed Edinburgh and Leith the day before his final appeal was heard by Sheriff McConaughey on the 4th of April 1916. Arthur was one of a small group of absolutists in Scotland who refused any form of compromise or cooperation with the authorities. No one at that time knew what the penalties would be applied, but absolutists like Arthur were prepared to pay the ultimate price and face continuous imprisonment. He received 5 court-martials and was imprisoned in Glencorse Barracks, Wormwood Scrubs, and for a short period in the Tower of London. That's another story. Before returning to Edinburgh's Calton Jail, where apart from the daily exercise break, he was never allowed outside his cell for over 2 years. This was a harsher treatment than other COs received. He described Calton as the poorhouse of all prisons with the cold chill of a grim fortress. The harshest punishment endured by Arthur and other COs was not the repulsive food or the chill and the cold. It was the solitary confinement coupled with being able to talk to other prisoners. This silence and loneliness drove several COs insane. Arthur and a group of other COs were finally released without notice from Calton on the 2nd of March 1919, shortly after a hunger strike that lasted several days. They gave this up after an appeal by the governor linked to the Spanish flu epidemic that was sweeping the country at that time. The release of COs was also delayed until those in the armed services were demobbed and given preference in finding employment. That's the bulk of what I had to say. And most of all this was gleaned from the unpublished papers of Arthur, which were held at the National Library of Scotland. I'm glad to say that a scholarly, an edited autobiography of Arthur Woodburn is now available. It was edited by Gordon Pentland for the Scottish History Society and published in 2017. This gives a very detailed picture of life in Calton Jail, and I would recommend it to anyone who's interested. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ken. How inspiring to hear that part of the story of Arthur Woodburn, and I'm sure that many people will want to pursue that further. So next, we'd like to hear from Joyce Taylor, remembering her grandfather, John S. Taylor, also a First World War conscientious objector.
Thank you, Brian. I'm sorry you can't see me. For some reason, my video has dropped out, but I think you have a photograph of my grandfather, John S. Taylor. And John S. Taylor was born in 1885 in Govan in Glasgow. And as a young man, he served his apprenticeship as an engineer. He won a scholarship from the Amalgamated Society of Engineers to go to Ruskin College, Oxford, where he studied for 2 years. And at the end of this period, his future was decided not in engineering, but in politics. And he became the organising secretary of the Glasgow Independent Labour Party that we've just heard about from Arthur Woodburn. So my grandfather was one of these ILP people. And the ILP was a movement working for those in poverty, in unemployment, and in terrible housing. And they believed in the international brotherhood of the workers. So they didn't understand why you would go and kill. So they saw no business in fighting one another. At the age of 26, my grandfather was elected a member of the Govan Town Council and then a year later to Glasgow Town Council. And when war broke out, he could have returned to engineering and been exempt from military service, but he chose to stand by the ILP and his pacifist principles. And he was a leading spokesman against the war, and he travelled the country addressing meetings. And I have a photo of him addressing an anti-conscription meeting in Glasgow. And it says at the bottom, it would be difficult to imagine conditions less favourable for an open-air meeting than those that prevailed in Glasgow on Sunday. And in spite of this, Councillor Taylor had a large and attentive audience while he spoke. The rigours of travel, crisscrossing the country to speak at rallies, the lack of rest, because he declined to take any holidays from the start of war, and the increasing hostility to anti-war sentiments all took their toll on him. And when conscription was enacted in 1916, he filled in his exemption from military service on conscientious grounds. And I have it there, and under the name of his employer, it says the Glasgow Independent Labour Party, and then under the section that says business, it says the propagation of peace and socialism. Filling in this form was to be one of his final acts, because he travelled to address a peace rally in Trafalgar Square in protest against the restriction of liberties under the War Acts. And The Guardian reported that it was in no sense a peace meeting. 2 London newspapers had published strongly abusive articles, and various people had put it about that the Federation was assisted by German money. According to the demonstrators, they received a very friendly greeting in the streets, but in Trafalgar Square, there was an organised effort made by soldiers to stop the meeting. My grandfather returned to Glasgow exhausted, depressed, and ill. Poison from a bad tooth had entered his bloodstream, and he had no resilience to fight it. And in his own words in his diary, he was a done man. and he died on the 11th of July 1916, leaving a widow and 3 boys aged 1, 3 and 5. And the 3-year-old was my father, Tom Taylor, and my father would carry on his father's legacy, both in politics and as a conscientious objector in the Second World War. And his pacifism led him to Quakers, and then I too became a Quaker. So this thread of opposition to war has linked 3 generations of my family, and I feel it's important that those who followed their conscience in both world wars and stood firm despite enormous legal, political and social pressures to go to war are recognised and commemorated. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joyce. It's so inspiring, and of course, many conscientious objectors died in or as a result of imprisonment, and many languish in prison today. We tend to focus on the men as conscientious objectors because conscription has so often been of men. That's not the case always, and of course opposition to war is more general, and we're going to hear now from Jane Lewis, who's going to talk to us, tell us about a song that she's written that's inspired by some of the women of the No Conscription Fellowship.
Thanks, Brian. Yes, so the song that we're going to see shortly, hopefully see and hear a video of Protest in Harmony, Edinburgh's radical street choir that both Penny and myself have been very involved with over the years, singing a song called which I wrote back in 2016 called Here We Are Again. And the song was inspired by the Peace News exhibition The World Is My Country, which was a visual celebration of the people and movements that opposed the First World War. And the story is that on the 22nd of April 1918, the police destroyed the machinery belonging to the printer Samuel Street, who had been printing the Tribunal, the newspaper of the No Conscription Fellowship. And Lydia Smith, head of the No Conscription Fellowship press department, said, when the police went to dismantle, as they called it, the second printer, they were jubilant. They said, that will be the end of that. And this phrase comes into the song. And therefore, when we came out with, Here We Are Again, they took it very badly. That's the end of the quote by Lydia Smith. And Here We Are Again was the headline of the 1-page leaflet of the Tribunal, which was printed exactly on schedule 3 days later. And it was printed because the women were totally prepared. They'd got a hand press, ink and paper all set up in a basement, and they managed to carry on printing the paper in secret throughout the remainder of World War I, right up until the 8th of January 1920. And the other phrase that you'll hear in the chorus of the song, We Stand for Liberty, was the title of the closing section of the 1-page leaflet that was printed. And I just want to read a short quote from that section. The press in this country is no longer free. It is bound hand and foot and is the servile tool of those who fasten militarism upon us. But in spite of that, we still believe that liberty of the press is as much worth struggling for and being persecuted for as it was in the days gone by. We have no fear of the ultimate result of the conflict between the spirit of violence and the ideal for which we stand. And the last bit of the story that I want to tell you, which you'll hear about in the 3rd verse of the song, which says, the bobbies saw them come and go with prams and mothers' things. And the police were actually watching the basement where these women were printing the paper, but they never actually believed that it could be women who were printing the paper. So they didn't do anything to try and stop them. So I think we're going to hear the song shortly. There's a very important part in the song for the printing press. It's a rhythmical part. So do feel free to join in. Hopefully there'll be some folk from Protest in Harmony watching who can sing along as well.
Here we are again, we stand for liberty and unity, and the name of rest and free. Here we are again, we stand for liberty and unity, and the words of faith to see. We have done for you this time, they said, and that'll be the end of that. And they thought they'd smash the paper dead, so the words of peace could not be read. Here we are again, we stand for liberty and unity, and the way of rest and free. Here we are again, we stand for liberty and unity, and the words of peace to see. So the women bought some paper and type, a hand press and some ink, and they dipped their tools right out of sight, and they ran that press both day and night. Here we are again, we stand for liberty and unity, and the way of rest and free. Here we are again, we stand for liberty and unity, and the words of peace to see. The boys saw them come and go with bands and mother's things, but they never thought that there below it was women who ran the printing show. Here we are again, we stand for liberty and unity, and the king of rest and free. Here we are again, we stand for liberty and unity, and the words of peace to see.
Very lovely, thank you. Thanks, Protest in Harmony, all of you out there watching. So we could hear you singing along. Now, I'd like to introduce next Andrew Farrar. Andrew's spoken to us in previous years about his grandfather and father who were conscientious objectors to the First World War. Today, though, Andrew's also been doing some research as part of the WEA Scotland Legacies of Resistance to the First World War project. And we contributed to that project, the Peace and Justice Center, and to the creation of the booklet, Legacies of Resistance to the First World War, which is available online from our website. And Andrew's going to tell us the stories of a couple of the COs that he's researched that are part of that booklet.
Yes, I've got two people I'm going to speak about. The first is Andrew White, who, though a native of Fife, received his early education in Dundee, and having moved to Glasgow as a youth with his parents and the rest of the family, he took further training before entering a business career. His father would have appreciated him going to university. After a few years in London, where he met his wife and joined the Society of Friends, Quakers, he returned to Scotland shortly before the First World War, joining a firm of industrial ceramic manufacturers. With the passing of the Military Act of 1916, he realized that when appearing before a tribunal, he would need strong support for claiming absolute exemption. He approached and received from his employer, Mr. Howie of J&R Howie, sorry, I can't see what I've written, of J&R Howie Limited, fire clay manufacturers, the statement that as head of a vital department at work of national importance, Andrew was exempt from military service, but had refused to accept that exemption. Also, he received from Mr. Hansford of the Nobel Explosives Works in Ardrossan that he had refused an unsolicited offer to reorganize the office on the grounds that to do so would ultimately make him party to the production of war materials. And he also received a letter from Richard Field, who was the clerk of the General Meeting of Scotland at the time, which stated that he could testify that Andrew had held his pacifist beliefs and become a Quaker before the war. In August 1916, Andrew attended his military service tribunal in Kilmarnock and pleaded absolute exemption. This was refused, and he was sent to the civil prison in Ayr before going to his appeal at Wormwood Scrubs. There he was given 90 days hard labour before being returned to Ayr, where he spent some time. Here he refused to obey orders and so started a repeat cycle of court-martial, prison, and so on. By January 1919, he had served a total of 4 sentences in Wormwood Scrubs, in Ayr, and both prisons in Glasgow, Barlinnie and Duke Street, involving more than 2 years hard labour, and he was released on medical grounds in March of 1919. After the war, Andrew returned to his pre-war employer, where over time he became a company director by the time of his retirement, which was in the late 1940s. Within Quakers, he served as treasurer for 25 years in several Scottish committees and in the and he was also involved in the organization of bringing the the London-based yearly meeting of Quakers to Edinburgh in 1948. In some ways, I've heard today about some of the other absolutists in Scotland, and Andrew's thing was very similar to theirs. Though he was known to have asked one of the warders in one prison if he could have a brush and a bucket to brush the floor before he lay on it. Slightly younger than Andrew was Donald Gray. Donald Gray was the son of a surgeon and a Glasgow University lecturer, and he belonged to a long Scottish family of Quaker roots. Some of you may have eaten Grey Dun biscuits and so on. That is one of the Greys. The Grey of that was I believe his grandfather. One of his teachers remembered him as not outstanding, except in his complete naturalness, and thoroughly interested in his work and play. On leaving school, he went first to Glasgow University and then to Merton College, Oxford. With the outbreak of war, Donald heard very quickly of the proposal to set up an ambulance unit. A group of pacifists, many of them Quakers, volunteered to join. They set up under the aegis of the British Red Cross Society, which became known as, their unit became known as the Friends Ambulance Unit, which ran ambulance convoys and ambulance trains. Donald, after training, went with the first draft to cross to Dunkirk on the 31st of October 1914. He started by building a typhoid hospital, but much time was spent in providing the civilian population with general medical treatment. At this time, Donald notes that we inoculated practically the whole population against typhoid. We distributed chloride of lime to the villagers to purify their water. We issued from rows of barrels all over Ypres purified water. We distributed relief, and one of our chaps had charge of converting the swimming baths into a huge tank of purified water for the troops. Their work was tasking. They covered the whole front, from the Canadian to the British, Belgian, and French end. In the office at Dunkirk in the morning, before going with the ambulance to an exposed point, this was each day, to an exposed and an exposed first aid post at Ypres was not unusual. During 1915, the historian G.M. Trevelyan set up an ambulance unit, a similar one, in Italy, aided by several from the FAU, including Donald. They undertook similar duties on the Italian front, that's between Italy and Austria, as they had in Belgium, on the Belgian front. Again, it was noted that Donald's judgments were proved to be events to be not far wide of the mark, and revealed a shrewdness of surmise that belied his age. However, he enjoyed the chance to explore the mountains and countryside of northern Italy. In August 1917, Donald, as a non-combatant, joined the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve and became an intelligence officer at Malta on the staff of the Commander-in-Chief Mediterranean, maintaining their records of enemy submarines. He said he was regularly received reports from one particular submarine to say, would they send a boat to collect the people floating in the sea near where they had just buried the boat. Note, Donald never registered as a conscientious objector, as he'd left Britain before the 1916 Military Act and didn't return until he was demobbed in January 1919. On arriving home, he returned to Oxford to read geography, gaining a diploma with distinction. And in 1921, he returned to his old school in York as an assistant master and became headmaster in 1927. He died in office in the summer of 1943. I was lucky in that I think I mentioned there, but I may not. I was lucky in that I happened to have biographies of both of those people that were in my family's collection. I just was about to write it all up when they suddenly appeared off a shelf. Where they had come from, I don't know, but there they were. So some of that was gained from those two books.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Extraordinary stories of some of these conscientious objectors, very varied, and in many ways, it's extraordinary to hear of COs who've made such significant contributions to society as well. Let's move on now to hear really about a bit more on the Second World War theme from David Mumford and then from Elizabeth Wilson. And a bit also about some of the support I think David's going to tell us for conscientious objection that's going on today.
Okay, I'm David Mumford. I'm a retired Episcopal priest and also a board member of the Fellowship of Reconciliation in England and Scotland. And the fellowship began back in 1914 when, after a church conference in Constance, an English Quaker, Henry Hodgkin, and a German Lutheran, Friedrich Sigmund Schulze, shook hands and said, "We are one in Christ, and we can never be at war." And this commitment to the enthronement of love and to gospel nonviolence led to many FOR members becoming conscientious objectors. I'd like to share with you two FOR members who were COs in the Second World War, Wilfred Dalley and Jock Wilson. Wilfred was born in 1919 and brought up in a strong Congregationalist family. He saw his faith as something which forbade him to kill other human beings. He registered as a CO. Although his father had fought in France, the family supported Wilfred in his Christian pacifism. Wilfred had seen civilian casualties in the Blitz. He refused to take up arms and be part of causing such casualties, but he was willing to accept alternative service. The tribunal accepted this, and as a consequence, Wilfred became part of the Friends Ambulance Unit. He worked in Scotland, Egypt, and Greece, where he founded the Public Health Laboratory in Patras, which is still named after him, the Wilfred Dalley Laboratory. After the war, he became a mature medical student, and for almost all his working life was the general practitioner in Edzell, a village near Brechin in Angus, where I was episcopal rector. He also had a large military base, and Wilfred sometimes provided service there. He joined the Society of Friends in 1956 and was active in the Northern Friends Peace Board. And I first came across him when I was working with the FOR in Northern Ireland in 1972, and Wilfred was one of those who put together the booklet Orange and Green. At that time, a powerful attempt to explain the situation in Northern Ireland to outsiders. His was a firm and lifelong witness and commitment to peace and non-violence. He died in 2002.
I'm going to talk, I'm Elizabeth Wilson, and I'm going to talk about my father, John Richardson Wilson, who is generally known as Jock. He was born on the 18th of March 1918, and he died on the 24th of December 1982. Jock was brought up a Methodist, and he took to heart "Thou shalt not kill," deciding that war was wrong. He held this firm conviction from the age of about 12. He had an uncle reputedly in the Tower of London, Henry Richardson, during the First World War, but we haven't got any firm documentary evidence about that. On the 6th of December 1939, he was, as you can see from the certificate on the screen, he was registered unconditionally as a CO. And after that, he worked for a year at the YMCA, I think over a year at the YMCA in Edinburgh, before pursuing theological studies. In 1943, he met my mother, Mary MacArthur Fleming, a birthright Quaker, at a Fellowship of Reconciliation meeting in Cambridge, where they were both studying. Jock was ordained 3 years later as a Presbyterian minister, and was the minister of St. Bride's in Edinburgh from 1955 to 1970. And my first political memory is of him railing from the pulpit against suicide. He remained a member of the FOR throughout his life.
The wider concerns of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, because although it started in the United Kingdom and Germany, fellowships were soon established in other countries, and in 1919 the International was founded. IFOR now has some 80 member organisations in over 40 countries, many interfaith, some specifically Christian, Muslim, Jewish or Buddhist, but all of them endorsing spiritually based non-violence. The International Fellowship has 2 staff members based in Geneva, part funded by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. And they work with the United Nations and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to promote the right to conscientious objection. Each UN country has to report on their human rights record every few years, and not all countries cover conscientious objection in their report. In some cases, like Costa Rica, as they do not have an army, others do not have conscription, and in a few, the issue has not been able to be tested. Questions can be asked and gentle pressure exerted, and over the years, significant developments in CO's rights have taken place. Two countries that have recently made real improvements are South Korea and Azerbaijan. On the other hand, the situation in Eritrea is still very bad, and for different reasons. One would not want to be a CO in Singapore, Turkey, Turkmenistan, or Egypt. Jehovah's Witnesses can find things especially difficult. As an appeal, if you're not already involved, please do consider joining in the War Resistance International scheme to send cards and letters to imprisoned COs. Those imprisoned value the reality of external support. And correspondence can also help with the quality of the CO's imprisonment if the powers that be are aware that there is international support for them. In the United Kingdom, our problems are more with recruitment to the armed forces of people under the age of 18, with poor information to members of the armed forces that they can apply to be conscientious objectors. And we have difficulties too with an assessment procedure on that while it's aware of the validity of pacifism on religious or moral grounds, considers any selective refusal to fight, e.g. refusing to join in the invasion of Iraq or the use of weapons of mass destruction, as primarily politically motivated and inadmissible. The Fellowship of Reconciliation in Scotland is proud to support this day, and we salute the courage of those who refuse to kill.
Thank you, David and Elizabeth. Now, as we've heard from David, conscientious objectors around the world can come from many faith traditions, but can come also from political points of view. We've heard stories of many men who have been conscientious objectors, primarily in Britain in the past. We're going to move on now to hear from Lane Demant, who is an intern working with the Peace and Justice Center, who has been doing some research and writing about contemporary conscientious objectors, Israeli women conscientious objectors, who come from another perspective. Lane?
Hi, can you hear me? All right, so my name is Lane Diamant. I'm a politics student at the University of Edinburgh, an intern with the Peace and Justice Center, and I'm currently speaking from my home in Chicago. For International Conscientious Objectors Day, I would like to highlight the modern feminist conscientious objectors movement in Israel so that we might draw from their strength and understand the challenges young people face in defying militarism today. The military holds a place of reverence in Israeli culture, widely recognized socially and politically as a central aspect of people's lives. Those who do not serve their mandatory term in the military face harsh social stigma and discrimination. But every year, a small number of dedicated teenagers refuse to be drafted into the military, a cause that has been strengthened by the efforts of feminists and united by a refusal to engage in violence against any person. The first CO that I'd like to recognize is Idan Halili, who was one of the first women to stand in front of the Israeli Military Conscience Committee to object to mandatory service on the specific grounds of feminism. Halili refused to serve in the military in 2005 because she found it to be male-dominated and structured by a sexist power division. For women to be successful soldiers means they must identify with and act according to stereotypical masculinity, which Halili describes as being aggressive, emotionless, and oppressive. And from her involvement with women's support groups, Halili learned that sexual harassment is rampant and underreported in the military, a situation she understandably wanted to avoid. In sum, Idan Halili's feminist principles were diametrically opposed to military service, grounds of conscience that prevented her from engaging in an inherently unequal and violent system. Halili served 2 weeks in prison, an experience she characterized as distressing, dehumanizing, and lonely, before the Conscience Committee finally heard her case and granted her exemption as a feminist. More recently, a conscientious objector named Tamar Ze'evi was one of the few who specifically cited the occupation of the Palestinian territories as her reason for refusing service. Despite the intensity and length of the occupation, the Israeli army classifies such objections as politically selective conscience, which is not applicable for legal exemption. Ze'evi cites studying abroad during high school as the most influential experience for her to examine Israel's actions critically. When Tamar Ze'evi explicitly refused to engage in the violence and oppression of the Palestinians, the army responded by repeatedly sentencing her to jail for a total of 115 days during 2016 and 2017. Despite the price Ze'evi paid for speaking out against the occupation, she maintains that morally and philosophically, she made the right choice. And finally, a small number of other countries, including China and Norway, have also made national service compulsory for women. In nations where this is the case, there is often a pervasive discourse equating equal conscription with total equality. Thus, women must fulfill their duty to the military in order to be considered equal citizens and members of society. We need to consider how to best support women who might be caught between a rock and a hard place. Women who might not want to participate in the military on grounds of conscience, but who cannot, for reasons such as caring obligations or poverty, risk breaking the law or the fundamental expectations of society. The women who have done so, like Halili and Ze'evi, demonstrate just how difficult it is to be a feminist conscientious objector from a country with compulsory military service, but also how meaningful such actions can be to confront militarism, domination, and violence against women and all people. Thank you.
Thank you, Lane. Lane was speaking to us today from Chicago, where I think she's also practicing social distancing there, and but unable to get back to the University of Edinburgh for the time being. So we hope you can be back soon. We are taking a bit longer than we had planned to take, so I really, we appreciate those of you who are staying with us, and we haven't long to go. But this part now of the program, we'd like to move on to hear about the plans for an opposing war memorial in Edinburgh's Princess Street Gardens, a project that we've been working on for a few years now. And we're going to hear now from the artist who has created the design for the memorial, Kate Ive.
Hi, I'm Kate Ive, and I'm really pleased to be joining you for the CO Day Vigil. I'm an artist and I'm based at the Edinburgh Sculpture Workshop, though I'm not joining you today from my studio, but rather at a distance from my home studio. In 2018, I was selected as lead artist for the Conscientious Objectors Memorial that's to be sited in Princess Street Gardens. And I'm really pleased to be able to share some of the details and the design of the memorial with you. I'm going to show you a series of images that share what the design is for the memorial, and I'm going to walk you through the ideas behind each element. So here we go. I wanted to start off by showing you a photograph of the model for the memorial. You can see that the memorial consists of a bronze tree sculpture and a reflection space with seating. I began my design process by researching about conscientious objection, and really early on I found this quote about an emergency meeting in 1916 in London for conscientious objectors. During the meeting, as the audience was cheering the speakers, an angry mob was gathering outside. So the chairman of the meeting asked the audience not to cheer anymore. Instead, he asked if they would flutter their handkerchiefs in appreciation of the speaker. And the quote goes like this: "No one who was present will forget the effect of this, and the distinguished speakers were greeted with thousands of fluttering handkerchiefs, making the soft sound of a rising and falling breeze." I found that incredibly poetic, and it started me off thinking about handkerchiefs as one possible element that might be a means of telling some of the story of conscientious objectors. Thinking about handkerchiefs then led me to discover the handkerchief tree, which is actually a real tree. It is a really beautiful and unusual tree. As you can see in this photograph, it has these white hanging bracts that flutter from the branches. This got me thinking about sculpting and casting a tree in bronze in order to be permanent, so it could go into a site like Princes Street Gardens. So on the left here you can see a sketch for how the bronze handkerchief tree might look. It's about 2 meters tall, and as you can see it would have these hanging handkerchiefs. I then started to think a bit more in more detail about how these handkerchiefs could be designed, and I realized that each handkerchief could have a embroidered element, so it would become this multifaceted tree to share all these really interesting and individual aspects of conscientious objection. So here is a selection of possible emblems and designs and images that could be incorporated into the 30 hanging handkerchiefs. In order to make the handkerchiefs on the tree permanent as well, they would also need to be cast in bronze. I have a granite seat in the reflection space. Now, the granite seat is inspired by gabion walls, and that type of boxed and caged stone is associated with defence systems, creating a sort of defended safe space. The seat is made from granite, inspired by the WW1 COs that went to Dyce in Aberdeenshire and worked in a quarry there breaking rocks. The backrest will also be engraved with an inscription that clearly dedicates the memorial to conscientious objectors. It was important to me to try and represent the past, present and future of conscientious objectors, and in order to do that, the handkerchiefs at the bottom of the tree will be the embroidered ones, and as you work your way up to the top there will begin to be handkerchiefs that are not embroidered, and represents those that are yet to be conscientious objectors and are yet to take that stand. So that's really a snapshot of the memorial, and I hope you've enjoyed hearing about it. If you would like to learn more about the memorial or about my artwork, you're welcome to visit my website at www.kateive.co.uk. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Oh, thanks, Kate. Now, there's a number of ways that you out there who are watching and listening tonight can be part of the Opposing War Memorial to Conscientious Objectors. If you're watching on Facebook, you could find an earlier post of the video about the CO Memorial and share that and help spread the word. If you haven't seen the video, watch it. It's just 4 minutes. You can find out more about the memorial also by visiting the website opposingwar.scot. You can also help generate ideas for those bracts that Kate spoke about for the memorial itself to help demonstrate the diversity of conscientious objection. In November last year, Kate ran embroidery workshops in Dundee, Glasgow, and Edinburgh, part of the community engagement work on the Opposing War Memorial project. Participants learned some new skills and embroidered a simple design for a handkerchief. Each of them did that with the name of a conscientious objector or a design such as the logo for ICANN or the War Resisters Broken Rifle. Kate has kindly agreed to run online versions of the embroidery workshop later this summer, probably in June. No previous experience is necessary. If you want to register interest, go to the Opposing War Memorial website. That's opposingwar.scot, where you can find more info or message us or email us, just get in touch. And lastly, and not least, if you haven't already done so, you can donate to help us create the memorial. We've raised over £67,000 in donations to pay for the fabrication and installation of the bronze peace tree sculpture and granite bench that Kate described, and to install that in Princes Street Gardens, we still need to raise close to another £100,000. That sounds like a lot, and it is. We know there are many pressing needs, especially in these times, but we believe it's worth it. The memorial will be a lasting space for reflection on alternatives to war in the midst of 8 war memorials in the heart of Edinburgh, Scotland's capital city. We have support from City of Edinburgh Council for a site in Princes Street Gardens. and it's a World Heritage Site visited by millions of people annually. Our preferred site is by the Ross Bandstand near the center of the West Gardens. Now, with any installation of this kind in a World Heritage Site, that requires planning permission and site investigation. But we cannot get the site investigation done until there is progress on the major redevelopment of the gardens that's going on. That's known as the Ross development. That, however, is on hold at the moment due to the COVID situation, so we cannot expect progress for some months. But we're ready and waiting for the go-ahead to have that site investigation done and to move ahead with a planning application once that happens. So we'll do that and get that memorial installed in Princess Street Gardens later when we've raised the full amount that we need. So please dig deep if you can. If you have already given, we gratefully appreciate that. If you haven't given, please go to the website opposingwar.scot and make as generous a donation as you can to help bring this about. So we're going to close now with a song live this time from Penny Stone.
Hello, can you hear me? Somebody give me a thumb up. Perfect, thank you. Hello everyone, we're just going to have a wee sing along. I obviously don't know if you're singing along, but I hope you are singing along with me, and we're going to sing Tom Paxton's beautiful Peace Will Come. And I love this one for CO Day because it talks about just what one person can do, and that's, you know, it's many one people doing things that affects change in this world. Thank you hugely to all the speakers. It was fascinating to hear about the other elements of people's lives, the politics, of course, and the horticulture. I thought that was a right treat. And I honestly, as a feminist peace activist, never thought about the feminist implications of female COs. So thank you, Lane, and I'm looking forward to more conversations about that. So please do sing along. If you don't know it, you'll know it in a minute. It goes, peace, peace will come, and let it begin with me. Peace, peace, peace will come, peace will come, and let it begin with me. Now it's we need peace. Same tune. We need peace, and let it begin with me. Same again. We need peace, and let it begin with me. Lovely. We're gonna have peace again. Peace will come. Peace will come, and let it begin with me. We need peace. We need peace, and let it begin with me. Oh, my own life is all I can hope to control. Oh, let my life be lived for the good of us all. Let it bring peace, sweet peace. Peace will come, and let it begin with me. Peace will come. Peace will come, and let it begin with me. We need peace. We need peace, and let it begin with me. Oh, my own life is all I can hope to control. Oh, let my life be lived for the good of us all. Let it bring peace, sweet peace. Peace will come, and let it begin with me. Thanks, guys. See you at the CO Vigil, hopefully in person next year, back in the square.
All right, thank you so much, Penny. That was beautiful, and we were all singing along here on Zoom. I hope you all were singing along out there on Facebook live streaming. And thank you all. First of all, thank you to all of our speakers who contributed to this event. I hope the folks out there really learned something new, as I certainly did. I do every time. And really, we just finished now with, once again, saying that we hope that if you can make a contribution to the Opposing War Memorial, so that we can have this bronze peace tree in Princess Street Gardens in the future for many decades and even centuries to come. So peace to everybody, and have a great evening.